Hello and welcome to GIBS Business. Later in the show, we chat to Vusi Thembekwayo, who's putting Africa on the map in terms of motivational and public speaking. But first, Dianna Games is a leading commentator and author on Africa and heads up business consultancy Africa at Work. We chatted about the growth of African companies on the continent, what's driving it, and what future plans are. Dianna, welcome to studio.
Thank you.
Dianna, you've done a lot of work on the African continent, and I'm sure you've seen South African companies going into Africa and growing, but also a recent phenomena is African companies that are growing.
Yes, I think that's one of, if you like, the new wave of development in the rest of Africa is the fact that there's a lot of companies that are growing in their own markets, and then some of them are growing enough to expand and become basically the new multinationals on the continent. And in some cases they are expanding regionally. In some cases, for example, the Nigerian banks, you're seeing them going across the continent, further afield from their sort of immediate hinterland. They're presenting acquisition targets, certainly for other multinationals, including South African companies that have done a lot of acquisitions recently, which enables them to expand their footprint. It enables the company that's being acquired or the joint venture to have access to new skills, technology, funding, etc. You're getting a lot of private equity companies investing in these firms. You're seeing some of them going onto the stock exchanges and so on.
What's been the biggest driver in seeing the expansion of some of these companies?
The markets are kind of wide open in West Africa, East Africa. There's a lot of opportunity, and a lot of these companies are already big in their home markets. It's the same driver basically as it is anywhere in the world, looking for new opportunity, for low-hanging fruit, positioning themselves ahead of their competition, and taking advantage of their, if you like, their home turf, as it were, in their regional home turf. You're particularly seeing that in East Africa, where companies are increasingly having a regional corporate view, as opposed to, for example, a Kenyan view, Ugandan view, and so on. The East African community is growing rapidly. It's deepening quite rapidly in terms of trade and so on. So in East Africa, you're getting a very, as I say, a deepening regional integration. In West Africa, it's starting to happen, but you don't have quite as cohesive a market in West Africa, because you have the Francophone and the Anglophone countries with different business cultures and so on. In Southern Africa, you're seeing some of that. Still quite a lot of corporate activity coming out of Zimbabwe. Companies are looking at regional expansion as a hedge against the lack of liquidity in Zimbabwe itself at the moment. Some of them had expanded earlier during hyperinflation in order to find foreign currency in other markets and so on. For example, Zambeef in Zambia, they've just recently listed on the London Stock Exchange. Some of the hotel companies, some of the local banks, and a lot of these companies are not brands known to people outside those countries, or perhaps outside those sectors in the region.
Dianna, you mentioned the capital injection that's come through private equity, some of the development finance institutions and so on. What are some of the challenges that they're finding in identifying some of these companies?
Well, the big problem really for private equity companies and even for stock exchanges is many of these big growing companies are family-owned companies. They see a lot of this access to capital is requiring them to firstly be transparent in a way that they haven't evolved as being, and also to perhaps give up some of the control that they've built up. And they're a specific type of company, and there's many of them. And in fact, even Dangote, for example, it is essentially a family-owned company. And for example, Nakumatt in the supermarket chain in Kenya, I mean, private equity people are just desperate to get their fingers on that company, but actually they're not giving up that kind of control. They source capital elsewhere and so on. So I think that would be one of the issues. But private equity has played a role in perhaps more in building kind of management and corporate governance in the companies where they have been able to invest. Which is all good for the growth of the African private sector, I think.
And in terms of competition, if we're seeing more of these companies going across their borders, more into regional, what has that meant in terms of competition between African companies?
Well, I think you've even seen it, say, for example, in South Africa, where a lot of South African companies moved into the immediate neighborhood, for example, Lesotho, Swaziland, Botswana, etc. And they are competing with each other in these other markets. And increasingly that's happening on the continent too, where you're getting companies from the same countries expanding and then competing with each other in other markets. You'll see that with the Kenyan supermarket groups, for example, who are also then competing with ShopRite. So I think it is making the landscape more competitive, because a lot of these companies also have a sort of a deep understanding of the markets of their region and how things work, and they have strong networks that they've built up, you know, from being local. And it's quite hard to compete with that as a newcomer unless you are a very extremely well-known brand that's well accepted, like a Unilever or a you know, some of those big international brands who've been around a long time.
Of course, we've seen some South African companies, for example, ShopRite closing down some of its operations in Nigeria because they didn't quite understand the market.
Well, ShopRite has closed its operations in Tanzania. Woolworths pulled out of Nigeria. They had 2 stores, I think, in Nigeria. I think the reasons for that are slightly different. The Africa story is very talked up, if I can put it that way. There's still a lot of challenges, and it really does require having as much information as you can, not about the statistics and the sort of the desktop information, if you like, but about really what can trip you up. You know, what are the things, what are the issues there, and you know, what are the costs and the risks, and there's a lot of that is quite hidden. And as these economies improve, the risk becomes a lot more nuanced, so it's harder for people to identify it, and it becomes far more specific to sectors, to cities, even to demographic groups, to people's aspirations and tastes, and particularly in the consumer space, and we're talking about 2 consumer companies there.
And how does one go about finding some of the deeper information?
Well, you talk to people who know the place. There's no substitute really for local knowledge. I get back to talking about the networks, you know, building networks of people on the ground, and not your own people from your own country, but the people who live there, because they know who's who, they know who your competition is likely to be, they know what the politicians might be doing. A lot of the risks are related to regulation, unexpected regulatory changes that might affect your bottom line.
Dianna, thank you so much for coming through today, and we wish to hear more from you.
Thank you.
Some of those companies, like the Dangote Group, have certainly made their mark. Vusi Thembekwayo has travelled the world and Africa and has made a name for himself as a motivational speaker. I caught up with him to learn more about his craft. Vusi, yours is an interesting journey. We don't find a lot of people in Africa choosing motivational speaking as a career. Can you tell us how you embarked on this journey?
Yeah, so I did public speaking in school, and I was, for my sins, quite good at it. So when I was 17, I won the world championship. And then when I was 19, I broke the world record in public speaking. And then I went and studied. I sort of thought, well, I'm clearly good and I can hold my own on stage. So I went and studied. I studied finance, and I worked a little bit in investment banking. And sooner rather than later, I suppose that calling came again. I really enjoyed what I did in finance, but I found it lacked a certain connection with people, and I wanted something where I could connect with people. And so I gave it all up. Quite literally, I just walked away from all of it, and I decided that I want to speak and do that for a living. And it's been an amazing 10 years now.
Wow. I'm just going to go back. You won the world record for public speaking. What did that entail?
So you go through, so there are competitions that are held every second year by a global body in public speaking, and they invite the best speakers from around the world, and you come and you compete, and it's like a World Cup. You go through rounds, and there's knockoff rounds, and then there's the quarterfinals, semifinals, and finals. So I won it when I was 17, went back when I was 19, and I set the world record at 19.
On the continent and also locally, we see a lot of international motivational speakers coming on board. Why do you think it is that we haven't had local African and South African well-known public speakers?
So it's a very good question, very, very good question. I think those of us who work in the industry, myself included, are quite guilty of being so busy working that we don't focus on making sure that we're evangelizing the craft and evangelizing the industry. That's the first. The second is that I think South Africans by nature, and I speak from experience, are quite, what's the word? They're quite skeptical. So when you speak to them, they are quite skeptical. Whereas if you come with a bit of a foreign accent, there is a credibility that South Africans attach to it. I'm not sure why that is, but if you speak with a foreign accent, for some other strange reason, you'll sell more tickets to your event than a South African speaker would. That said, I have worked. In fact, last year alone, I worked in 17 countries. So I spent more time outside the country than I did here. I earned more foreign earnings than I did here. Don't tell SARS, please. But I can tell you right now that any South African speaker can hold their own against any global speaker. I'm in Morocco in 2 weeks' time. I was in London last week, and I guarantee you that if you're seeing a good top talent South African speaker, they can hold their own and compete with any speaker from around the world. I think it's fantastic that the speakers from other parts of the world are coming here because they're clearly giving the spotlight the industry needs. But I do think it's something we as South Africans need to be careful of to ensure that we don't get to the point where we support so much that which is foreign to ours. Because in essence, they do come here, but then they take the cash and take it to their own countries. And if we want to develop our own country and our own economy, we need to really think about how we're going to treat that.
Let's talk about Africa. Last couple of years, African economies have been growing. The middle income is rising. Have you found that that has necessitated a greater need for your craft?
Huge. Huge. I've been to Luanda twice, just this year alone. I'm going back to Luanda and Angola in 3 weeks' time. I was in Zimbabwe, Zaire, Zimbabwe and Zambia. I'm doing the DRC Congo in August. Massive, massive. You cannot imagine. Let me put it to you this way. For every inquiry I get from London, I'm getting 3 from other parts of the continent. It's huge. And also the industry is at its infancy. So there aren't many structures there. Whereas in South Africa, there's speakers agencies, they're gateway people. So they're speakers agencies and people that represent speakers, as is the case in other Western parts of the world. If you go to do business in Nigeria, it's usually going to be you and the client directly. So there aren't most of those infrastructures there. There aren't any showcases for speakers being held in any of those parts of the world, which is great because it means we can get in, we can set up the infrastructures as South Africans, and we can conquer those parts of the market.
If you can just tell us about your typical audience.
Business. So I speak to business people. So really what we've done in our own organization, so I speak 99% of my time, and then I'm a chairperson of a small private equity firm. So what we've done is over the past 7 years, we've done research into what it is we believe separates great organizations from their mediocre ones. And we call that research the black sheep. And we looked at different industries over different times, and we did a peer-to-peer matching. So we'd look, for instance, at a ShopRite versus a Pick and Pay. Like-for-like revenues in 2002, and today ShopRite is almost 3 times the size of a Pick and Pay if you just consider top line. And then we asked very telling questions around what it is that great organizations did versus those which they compete with who've not achieved the same or similar kind of results. And we took all of that and we published it into publishable works, and that's what I speak about. So most of my clients invite me wanting to find out one of 3 things. One, how do we become excellence? How do we become great and not good? Second, how do we do business in the rest of the continent? And third is how do we keep our people enthused about what it is we're trying to do?
Vusi, final question. In your industry, there's a lot of skepticism about what motivational speakers talk about and what value they bring, especially in the business world. How do you navigate around that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that's really more a client question. I think clients today have to know what it is you're looking for and what it is you're getting. And so there are speakers out there that we just call hot air. These are tough times don't last, but tough people do kind of speakers. You walk out of there, you feel great and enthused. And so it's important for clients to begin to ask the telling questions around what is the track record of this individual? What have they done? Where have they done it? And what have they achieved? And what have they delivered in those organizations? Second is what is their content? And any speaker who cannot tell you what his content is the kind of speaker you don't want to hire. We call those speaker for hires. They'll tell your audience whatever you think that your audience needs to hear.
Vusi, thanks for your time.
It's been an amazing pleasure. Thank you, Jose.
That is certainly an interesting career. Thank you to both our guests. Until next week, take care.